The wind was a blade against the high plains, sharpening itself on the jagged peaks of the distant mountains before sweeping down into the miserable collection of buildings that called itself Progress. Snow, fine and hard as sand, scoured the frozen mud of the main street, piling in silent drifts against the unpainted clapboards of the general store. It was a land that tolerated life but did not welcome it, a place where survival was a grim currency earned through calloused hands and a hardened heart. Inside the laundry, steam ghosted the windows, momentarily obscuring the bleakness outside. For Leanne, it was the only warmth she knew, a humid, suffocating heat that smelled of lye and sweat. Her hands were raw, the skin split and bleeding into the scalding water of the wash tubs. She was 18, but the reflection that shimmered back at her from the soapy water was of someone much older, her face a pale, bruised mask of exhaustion. The grey cheongsam she wore, a relic of a life before this one, was frayed at the collar and cuffs, its colour as washed out as her hopes. Her in-laws, a brother and sister duo who had purchased her passage and thus her existence, moved through the steam like malevolent spirits. The woman, her face a permanent scowl, would strike with a wooden paddle for a spot missed on a shirt. The man, smelling of cheap whiskey and resentment, preferred the back of his hand. They never spoke of the beatings. They were as routine as the rising sun, a part of the day's labor. Today, the man was in a particularly foul mood. He backhanded her for being too slow, the blow sending her stumbling against a stack of crates. She didn't cry out. Sound only ever made it worse. She simply picked herself up, the sharp pain in her cheek a familiar anchor in the dizzying haze of her life. It was then that the door opened, letting in a blast of Arctic air that cut through the steam. A man stood silhouetted against the white fury of the storm. He was tall and broad, wrapped in a heavy sheepskin coat, his hat pulled low. He stamped the snow from his boots, his presence seeming to suck the very air from the room. Jedediah Vance was not a man for towns. He came in twice a season for salt, flour, and coffee, his business conducted with minimal words before he retreated back to the isolation of his ranch nestled in the foothills. He saw the girl stumble. He saw the fresh, angry red mark blooming on her cheekbone. He saw the dull, vacant fear in her eyes, an expression he'd seen in a cornered animal just before the end. He looked from her to the sneering face of her keeper. He had seen it before, this casual cruelty, and had always turned away, believing it was not his affair. But today, something was different. Perhaps it was the sheer force of the blizzard outside, a reminder of how quickly life could be extinguished. Or perhaps it was the ghost of a promise he had made to himself long ago, a promise to not let the world's harshness grind away the last of his own humanity. He set his sack of flour down on the counter. The room was silent save for the hiss of the irons on the stove and the howl of the wind. He looked directly at Leanne, his gaze steady and clear. It held no pity, only a quiet, unyielding resolve. Her keeper stepped forward. "What do you want, rancher?" "Laundry ain't done." Jedediah ignored him. His eyes remained on Leanne, who had frozen by the tubs, her slender frame trembling almost imperceptibly. He spoke, his voice low and rough, yet it carried over the storm with the weight of a final judgment. "You're coming with me." The words hung in the steamy air, thick and unbelievable. Leanne's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. The man, her brother-in-law, let out a short, incredulous laugh that was half a sneer. "She ain't going nowhere. She belongs to us." Jedediah's gaze finally shifted, moving from Leanne to the man. There was no anger in his eyes, just a cold, flat certainty that was more intimidating than any rage. "No person belongs to another," he said, his voice as unforgiving as the winter landscape outside. He took a step forward, his worn leather boots making a soft, deliberate sound on the wooden floor. He wasn't a large man by the standards of brawlers or barroom toughs, but he was solid, carved from the same unyielding material as the mountains he called home. His presence was a quiet declaration of intent. The sister-in-law, a woman whose face was a roadmap of petty grievances, moved to stand beside her brother, her hands on her hips. "We paid for her passage. She owes us." Jedediah reached into his coat, but instead of a weapon, he pulled out a small leather pouch. He untied the drawstring and entered a small pile of gold coins onto the counter. They gleamed dully in the lamplight, a stark contrast to the grime of the laundry. "This will cover her debt," he stated, not asked. And her pain, the sight of the gold, momentarily stunned them into silence. Their greed warred with their pride. The brother licked his lips, his eyes darting from the coins to Jedediah, then to Leanne. He saw not a person, but a transaction. "She's damaged goods," he grumbled, a pathetic attempt to haggle. Barely worth half that. Jedediah didn't respond. He simply looked back at Leanne, his expression unchanging, and held out his hand. It was a large hand, calloused and scarred from years of hard work, but it was offered gently. It was an invitation, not a command. For Leanne, the world had shrunk to this single moment. Behind her was the certainty of pain, the scalding water, the endless work, the casual blows that chipped away at her soul. Before her was a stranger, a blizzard, and an unknown future that could be worse, but might, just might, be better. Fear was a cold stone in her stomach, but for the first time in years, a tiny, fragile spark of something else ignited within her. It was not hope, not yet. It was defiance. Her eyes met Jedediah's, and in their quiet depths, she saw not a master, but a sanctuary. Slowly, hesitantly, she wiped her wet hands on her tattered cheongsam and took a step forward. Then another. She walked past her stunned in-laws, her gaze fixed on the outstretched hand, and placed her small, trembling hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, his grip firm and warm. He didn't look back at the stunned couple or the gold on the counter. He simply turned and led her out into the storm. The blizzard enveloped them the moment they stepped outside, a blinding chaos of wind and snow. The world was reduced to a swirling vortex of white, the town of Progress disappearing behind them as if it had never existed. Jedediah led her to a sturdy horse tethered nearby, its coat already thick with ice. He moved with an unhurried efficiency, untying the reins and swinging himself into the saddle with a practiced motion. He then reached down for her, his arm a steady anchor in the storm's fury. She hesitated for only a second before allowing him to pull her up, seating her in front of him. The sheepskin of his coat was a rough, solid wall at her back, shielding her from the worst of the wind. He wrapped a thick woolen blanket around her shoulders, his movements impersonal yet thorough. He was protecting a charge, nothing more. They moved slowly, the horse picking its way through the deepening snow with a surefootedness that spoke of long familiarity with such weather. Leanne huddled into the blanket, the cold a biting, physical thing that seeped into her bones. The flimsy fabric of her cheongsam was no match for the plains winter. Yet, for the first time, the cold was only on the outside. A strange, unfamiliar warmth radiated from the man behind her, a simple human heat that felt more profound than any fire. She didn't know his name, or where they were going. She knew only the feeling of his steady presence and the rhythmic plodding of the horse. The journey was a blur of white. There were no landmarks, no sense of direction, only the relentless assault of the wind and the growing darkness of late afternoon. Jedediah said nothing, his focus entirely on navigating the treacherous landscape. His silence was not unkind, it was the silence of a man at work, a man comfortable in his own solitude. Leanne found it calming. It was a silence that demanded nothing of her, unlike the menacing quiet of the laundry that always preceded a blow. After what felt like an eternity, the terrain began to change. They entered a small canyon, the rock walls providing a slight buffer from the wind. Ahead, nestled against the base of a low mesa, was a faint, golden light. A cabin. As they drew closer, she could see it was small and sturdily built from dark timber, a plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney and dissolving instantly into the storm. A small barn stood nearby. It was the most isolated place she had ever seen, a tiny island of warmth in an endless ocean of white. He dismounted first, then gently helped her down. Her legs were stiff and numb, and she nearly stumbled, but his hand on her arm steadied her. He led the horse to the barn, and for a moment she was left alone, standing before the cabin door. The light from the window beckoned, promising a reprieve from the cold that had settled deep within her. It was a simple, solitary dwelling, yet it looked more like a home than any place she had ever known. Jedediah returned, his shoulders dusted with a fresh layer of snow. He pushed the heavy wooden door open, and a wave of warm, dry air washed over her, smelling of wood smoke and coffee. He stepped aside, holding the door for her. "Go on," he said softly. She stepped across the threshold, blinking in the sudden light. The interior of the cabin was a single room, dominated by a large stone fireplace where a healthy fire crackled and spat, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. The space was Spartan but clean, everything in its place. A simple wooden table with 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed was built into one corner, piled with thick blankets. Against the far wall was a small cooking stove and shelves stocked with tins and jars. It was a space built for one, a fortress of solitude. There was an orderliness to it that spoke of a quiet, deliberate life. Jedediah closed the door, shutting out the storm's howl. The sudden silence was profound. He shrugged off his heavy coat, hanging it on a peg by the door. Without it, he seemed less imposing, just a man weathered by the sun and the wind. He gestured towards the fire. "Get warm." "I'll make some coffee." Leanne moved hesitantly towards the hearth, extending her numb fingers towards the flames. The heat was a blissful shock, a tingling, painful sensation as life returned to her frozen skin. She watched him as he moved about the cabin, his actions economical and sure. He filled a pot with water from a bucket, spooned coffee grounds into it, and set it on the stove. He did not ask her questions or stare at her. He simply allowed her to exist in his space, a courtesy so foreign it felt like a kindness. When the coffee was ready, he poured it into 2 tin mugs, handing one to her. She wrapped her hands around it, the warmth a comforting weight. She took a sip, the bitter, hot liquid scalding a path down her throat. He sat at the table, cradling his own mug. "There's a room through there," he said, nodding towards a simple curtain hanging across a doorway she hadn't noticed before. "It's small. Used for storage mostly. But there's a cot." "It's yours." She looked at him, her eyes wide. Her own room. The concept was so alien she couldn't fully grasp it. For years, she had slept on a thin pallet on the floor of the laundry, always within earshot of her keepers. Privacy was a luxury she had never been afforded. She managed a small, barely audible sound. "Thank you." Jedediah gave a slight nod, his gaze fixed on the fire. "There's stew in the pot on the hearth. Eat when you're hungry." He seemed to understand that she needed time, that she was like a wild thing brought in from the cold, ready to bolt at any sudden movement. He offered her the basic necessities, warmth, food, shelter, without any expectation of gratitude or conversation. He gave her the one thing she craved more than anything else, a moment of peace. Later, after she had forced down a few spoonfuls of the rich, savory stew, she retreated to the small room he had indicated. It was tiny, as he'd said, containing only a narrow cot with a folded blanket and a small, high window through which the snow-swept darkness was visible. It was sparse, cold, and perfect. She touched the rough wool of the blanket, then sat on the edge of the cot. For the first time since she had left her home across the ocean, no one was watching her. No one was waiting to strike her. She was alone, and she was safe. And in the profound silence of the small, dark room, Leanne finally allowed herself to weep. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light through the cabin's windows. The blizzard raged for 2 full days, locking them inside, and then subsided, leaving behind a world of pristine, silent white. Jedediah fell into his routine as if she were not there. He would rise before dawn, stoke the fire, and head out to the barn to tend to his horse and the few cattle he kept. He would spend the day chopping wood, mending fences, or simply disappearing into the vast, snow-covered landscape, returning only as dusk began to settle. He never asked her to do anything. He left food out for her, and when her clothes were dry, he had laid out a simple wool shirt and a pair of sturdy denim trousers on a chair for her, practical, warm clothes that were a world away from her tattered cheongsam. She had put them on, the unfamiliar fabric feeling strange but solid against her skin. She folded her dress carefully and placed it at the bottom of a small wooden chest in her room. It felt like laying a part of her old life to rest. Leanne spent most of her time in the small room, watching him through the gap in the curtain. She saw the way he methodically cleaned his tools, the gentle way he spoke to his horse, the deep lines of thought on his face as he stared into the fire at night. He was a man of immense quiet, his life a testament to self-reliance. The silence in the cabin began to change. At first, it had been a tense, uncertain space between two strangers. Now, it was becoming a shared stillness, a comfortable quiet that didn't need to be filled with words. One afternoon, while he was out, she found a needle and thread in a small tin on a shelf. His coat, hanging by the door, had a long tear in the sleeve. Her hands, though still raw, remembered the delicate work taught to her by her grandmother long ago. She sat by the fire, the heavy sheepskin in her lap, and meticulously stitched the seam closed. Her stitches were small and neat, a line of order against the worn fabric. When Jedediah returned, stamping snow from his boots, he saw her finishing the last stitch. She flinched, expecting anger for touching his things. He stopped, his gaze falling on the repaired sleeve. He looked at the neat row of stitches, then at her, her head bowed over her work. He said nothing. He simply took off the coat and hung it back on its peg. But later, when he brought her a bowl of stew, their fingers brushed as she took it from him. His touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the first acknowledgement that she was more than just a rescued stray, that she was a presence in his home. A few days later, she began to emerge more from her room. She started by sweeping the floor, then washing the few dishes they used. They were small acts, her tentative attempts to contribute, to turn his sanctuary into a shared space. He accepted her help with the same quiet grace he did everything else, with a simple nod of his head that was beginning to feel like high praise. He was a man who communicated not with words, but with actions and acknowledgements. And she, a woman who had been taught that her voice was a liability, was beginning to learn his language. The first sign of trouble was a shadow on the snow. A week after the blizzard had passed, Jedediah was splitting logs when he saw it, a dark shape moving along the ridge overlooking his property. It was too far to make out clearly, but it was not a deer or a wolf. It was a man on horseback. He paused, his axe held loosely in his hand, his body still, watchful. He had chosen this isolated place for a reason, valuing the privacy and the peace it afforded. Visitors were rare and almost never unannounced. He watched until the figure disappeared behind a stand of pines, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. He didn't mention it to Leanne. He saw no reason to frighten her. But that evening, he cleaned his rifle with a slow, deliberate care she hadn't seen before, and he placed it on the mantelpiece above the fire, within easy reach. The next day, the tracks appeared. 2 sets, circling the edge of his land. They had been careful, keeping their distance, but their purpose was clear. They were scouting. Surveying. Jedediah's jaw was set in a hard line as he followed the tracks for a mile before turning back. He knew who they were. The men from Progress, her so-called family, had come to reclaim their property. The gold he had left them had not been enough to soothe their wounded pride. Leanne sensed the change in him immediately. The comfortable silence in the cabin was gone, replaced by a tense, vigilant quiet. He was still gentle with her, but his eyes were constantly scanning the horizon, his hand never far from the rifle on the mantel. Fear, a cold, unfamiliar companion, began to creep back into Leanne's heart. She knew, without him having to say a word, that her past was coming for her. The confrontation came 2 days later, at dawn. The air was still and frigid, the new-fallen snow glowing a soft pink in the morning light. They came not with subtlety, but with a blustering, misplaced confidence. The two of them, the brother and sister, rode right up to the cabin. The man was holding a rusty shotgun, his face flushed with a mixture of whiskey and bravado. "Vance," he shouted, his voice ugly in the morning stillness. "Send out the girl. We've come for what's ours." Jedediah opened the cabin door and stepped outside, closing it firmly behind him. He stood on the porch, unarmed, his hands loose at his sides. He looked at them, his expression one of weary disappointment. "She is not yours," he said, his voice calm and low, yet it carried clearly in the cold air. Go home, the sister sneered, her face pinched and cruel. She's our family. It's our right. Leanne watched through a crack in the window, her hands pressed against her mouth to stifle a cry. Her body trembled uncontrollably. She saw Jedediah standing between her and them, a solitary, unmovable guardian. He was one man against two, and one of them had a gun. The only right you have is to leave my land, Jedediah said, his voice dropping, taking on an edge of steel. Now the man raised the shotgun, its barrel wavering unsteadily. We ain't leaving without her. The threat hung in the frozen air, brittle and sharp. Jedediah did not flinch. He simply stood his ground, his body a shield between the cabin and the approaching menace. His calmness seemed to infuriate the brother-in-law more than any show of force could have. I'm not telling you again, Jedediah said, his voice a low growl. Turn around and ride away. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed the man might just pull the trigger. His knuckles were white on the stock of the shotgun, his face a mask of bitter resentment. But something in Jedediah's unyielding stance, in his complete lack of fear, gave him pause. Instead, he dismounted clumsily and lunged forward, intending to shove past Jedediah and storm the cabin. The movement was clumsy but swift. Jedediah met him not with a punch, but with a solid, grounding force. He caught the man's arm, using his momentum to spin him around and send him sprawling into a snowdrift. It was the efficient, practiced movement of a man who understood leverage and balance, not the wild flailing of a brawler. The sister screamed in rage, a shrill, piercing sound. The man scrambled up from the snow, his face contorted with fury and humiliation. He raised the shotgun again, this time with more purpose. Inside the cabin, Leanne's terror gave way to a white-hot surge of adrenaline. She would not hide while this man, this quiet, decent man, was hurt protecting her. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on the heavy iron poker resting by the hearth. Without a second thought, she grabbed it, her small hands wrapping tightly around the cool metal. The cabin door burst open. She didn't wait to see who it was. She swung the heavy poker with all her might. It connected not with the brother, but with the sister, who had slipped past Jedediah while he was occupied. The woman shrieked as the iron bar struck her shoulder, stumbling back out onto the porch. The distraction was all Jedediah needed. He moved with surprising speed, closing the distance to the brother, grabbing the barrel of the shotgun and wrenching it upwards just as it fired. The blast tore a hole in the morning sky, the sound echoing off the mountains. He twisted the weapon from the man's grasp and threw it deep into the snow. The fight was over before it had truly begun. The brother, disarmed and defeated, stared at Jedediah with wide, fearful eyes. The sister was clutching her arm, her face pale with shock and pain. They were bullies, their courage as thin as winter ice. Faced with true resolve, they shattered. Get off my land, Jedediah said, his voice dangerously quiet. If you ever come back, I will not be this patient. He stood over them, breathing heavily, a dark trickle of blood running from a cut on his temple where a stray piece of gravel had struck him. He was not a victor exulting in a fight, he was a man who had been forced to violence and hated it. The two of them scrambled for their horses, their retreat clumsy and panicked. They rode away without a backward glance, two small, pathetic figures swallowed by the vastness of the white landscape. Jedediah watched them go, his posture rigid until they were out of sight. Then, he seemed to deflate, leaning a hand against the porch railing. He turned and saw Leanne standing in the doorway, the heavy poker still clutched in her hands, her face a mixture of terror and fierce determination. Their eyes met, and in that shared glance, a new understanding passed between them. The storm had passed. Inside, he sank into a chair by the fire, the adrenaline leaving him looking tired and worn. Leanne gently took a cloth, dipped it in warm water, and began to clean the cut on his temple. Her touch was feather-light, hesitant. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice choked. This is my fault. He looked at her, his expression softening. He reached up and placed his hand over hers, stilling her movement. No, he said, his voice rough with emotion. This is not your fault. None of it is. In the quiet days that followed the confrontation, the space between them shifted. The last barrier of formality, of protector and protected, crumbled away, leaving something warmer and more fragile in its place. The act of her tending to his small wound, and he allowing it, had been a form of communication more intimate than any words they had yet shared. He began to talk to her, not in long conversations, but in small offerings of himself. He told her his name was Jedediah. He told her about the ranch, how he had built the cabin himself after he'd left the army, seeking a life where the only orders he had to follow were the turning of the seasons. One evening, sitting by the fire, he spoke of his wife, who had died of fever their first winter on this land. He spoke of her gently, with a sadness that had softened with time but had never truly faded. She would have liked you, he said, looking into the flames. She had a quiet strength, too. It was a profound offering of trust, and Leanne accepted it with the reverence it deserved. She, in turn, began to share pieces of herself. She told him her name, Leanne. She spoke of her village by the sea, of the smell of salt and fish in the air, of her grandmother who taught her to sew and to see the patterns in the stars. She did not speak of the boat, or the journey, or the laundry in progress. He did not ask. He understood that some wounds were too deep to be exposed to the air. They fell into a new rhythm, a domestic partnership born of shared survival and growing affection. She learned the simple art of baking bread, the dense, hearty loaves filling the cabin with a warm, comforting scent. He taught her how to read the sky for weather and how to tell the tracks of a fox from those of a coyote. They worked side by side, their movements becoming a practiced, unspoken dance. He would chop the wood, and she would stack it. She would cook their meals, and he would wash the dishes. One afternoon, he came in from the barn carrying a small, crudely made stool. "My hands aren't made for small work," he said, a hint of a smile touching his lips for the first time. "But I thought this might be better for you to sit on by the fire than that crate." The gesture was so unexpected, so tender, that it brought tears to her eyes. It was the first gift she had ever received that was made just for her, with her comfort in mind. That night, a soft warmth bloomed in her chest, a feeling she couldn't name but that she cherished like the fire on a cold night. The harsh lines of his face seemed softer in the firelight, and she found herself watching the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he was thoughtful. He, in turn, found himself listening for the soft sound of her footsteps, the cabin feeling empty and incomplete when she was in her small room. The quiet of his life was no longer a solitary peace, it was a shared silence, rich with her presence. The slow thaw of their hearts mirrored the world outside, as the iron grip of winter began to loosen its hold on the land. Spring arrived not as a sudden burst, but as a slow, hesitant softening. The snow receded from the south-facing slopes, revealing the damp, dark earth beneath. The icy creek at the edge of the property began to chatter and flow, its voice a welcome sound after months of silence. With the changing season came a change in the light, a golden warmth that lingered longer each evening, promising new life. Jedediah began to prepare the small plot of land beside the cabin for a garden. He worked the soil, turning it over with a spade, his movements strong and rhythmic. Leanne watched him from the porch, a sense of restlessness growing within her. The melting snow meant the roads would soon be passable. The world was opening up again. A choice was coming for her, a choice she had not had to consider while trapped by the winter. She could leave. She could make her way to one of the bigger cities, find a community of her own people, and disappear into the anonymity of a crowd. The thought was both terrifying and liberating. Here, with Jedediah, she was safe. She was cared for. But was this her life, or was she merely a guest in his? One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the last rays of sun paint the mountains in hues of purple and orange, he broke the comfortable silence. "When the pass is clear," he said, his voice even, his eyes on the horizon, "I can take you to the city. There's a stagecoach that runs east from there." He was offering her an escape. He was offering her freedom. The words were a test, and a gift. He was telling her that the door to her cage was open, that he would not hold her here. Her heart ached at the thought. To leave this quiet man, this small cabin that had become the only true home she had ever known. The idea of returning to a world of strangers, of having to be watchful and afraid again, was a cold dread in the pit of her stomach. She looked at his profile against the darkening sky, the strong line of his jaw, the kindness in his weary eyes. He had asked for nothing, and in doing so, had given her everything. He had given her back her sense of self. "Do you want me to go?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He finally turned to look at her, and the raw vulnerability in his gaze stole her breath. "No," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer hide. "I don't. This place, it was just a shelter before you came. Now it feels like a home." He reached out, his calloused hand covering hers where it rested on the porch railing. His touch was warm and sure. "This can be your home, Leanne. If you want it, the choice was hers. The world, or this man. The unknown, or this quiet, certain love that had grown between them like a resilient flower pushing its way through the frozen earth." She looked out at the vast, wild land spread before them, no longer seeing a place of hardship and survival, but a place of beauty and promise. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. "I am home," she said softly. The following morning, Leanne rose with the sun. She did not go to the main room but instead went outside into the crisp spring air. She walked to the small, tilled garden plot that Jedediah had prepared. The rich, dark earth smelled of life and possibility. She knelt, pressing her hands into the soil. It was cool and yielding. This was real. This was a place to put down roots. Later that day, when Jedediah was mending a fence line at the far end of the property, she took the small sack of beans he had set aside for planting. She spent the afternoon in the garden, carefully pressing each seed into the earth, creating neat, hopeful rows. It was a silent declaration, an answer given not in words, but in an act of faith. An act of beginning. When he returned at dusk, weary from his work, he stopped short when he saw the newly planted garden. He saw her, kneeling by the last row, her hands and the knees of her trousers smudged with dirt. She looked up at him, a shy, radiant smile on her face. It was the first time he had seen her truly smile, and the sight was more beautiful than any sunrise he had ever witnessed. He walked over and knelt in the dirt beside her, his larger, rougher hands resting near her smaller ones on the soil. He didn't need to ask what this meant. He knew. He had offered her a future, and she was planting it with her own 2 hands. Their life settled into a new, deeper harmony. The last of the snow melted away, and the plains exploded into a riot of green grasses and wildflowers. Leanne's garden began to sprout, the tender green shoots a daily miracle. Her presence softened the harsh edges of Jedediah's solitude. She filled the cabin with the scent of baking and the quiet hum of her presence. He, in turn, brought her small treasures from the land, an eagle's feather, a uniquely shaped river stone, a spray of wild bluebells which she placed in a jar on the windowsill. The love between them was like the landscape itself, vast, quiet, and deeply rooted. It was built not on grand pronouncements, but on 1,000 small, shared moments, the way he would gently tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the way she would have a hot cup of coffee waiting for him when he came in from the cold, the shared glances across the dinner table that spoke volumes. One evening, he brought out a small, intricately carved wooden box. It was the only ornate object in the entire cabin. He opened it and showed her a faded photograph of his wife. He had never shown it to her before. Then he placed her hand over his on the box. "The past is a part of us," he said softly. "But it's the future I want to build." With you, Leanne knew then that their healing was not about forgetting what they had lost or endured, but about building something new upon the foundations of their scars. They were 2 solitary souls who had found their other half in the most unlikely of places, their quiet love a testament to the resilience of the human heart. The seasons turned. Summer brought long, golden days and the sweet smell of hay. The garden flourished under Leanne's care, providing them with fresh vegetables that tasted of sunshine and rich earth. They worked together, moving in the easy, synchronized rhythm of people who know each other's thoughts without needing to speak. The harshness of the land remained, a constant reminder of the precarity of life, but it was no longer something to be feared. It was simply the backdrop to their shared existence, its wild beauty a reflection of the untamed, profound love they had found. He taught her the names of the constellations that glittered in the vast, clear night sky. She taught him how to make delicate dumplings, her fingers moving with a deftness that mesmerized him. They were from different worlds, their pasts separated by oceans and cultures, yet in the quiet sanctuary of the small cabin, they had created a world that was entirely their own. The memory of the laundry in progress, of the cruelty of her in-laws, began to fade for Leanne. It was not gone, but it had lost its power over her. The scars on her heart were healing, covered over by the gentle balm of Jedediah's love and the simple, peaceful rhythm of their days. For Jedediah, the deep ache of his loneliness, a companion for so many years, had vanished. The silence of his home was no longer empty, it was filled with the soft sounds of Leanne's presence, a music that had soothed the unquiet parts of his soul. His life, which had been a study in survival, had become a study in joy. He found himself smiling for no reason, his heart feeling impossibly light. One warm afternoon, they rode out to the high ridge that overlooked their valley. They sat on a sun-warmed rock, their shoulders touching, and looked down at the small cabin and the barn, the green patch of the garden a vibrant jewel against the brown earth. From this vantage point, it looked so small, so fragile against the immense backdrop of the mountains and the sky. Yet it was their entire world. It was the place where two broken people had pieced each other back together, creating something stronger and more beautiful than what they had been before. Jedediah took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. "I never thought I'd have this again," he said, his voice thick with emotion. A lithe Leanne leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full. She looked at the strong, gentle man beside her, the man who had walked into the darkest moment of her life and led her into the light. He had not been a knight on a white horse, but a quiet rancher in a sheepskin coat. His grand gesture was not a declaration of war, but a simple, life-altering sentence, "You're coming with me." He had rescued her, but in doing so, she had rescued him right back. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. Below them, a light flickered on in the window of their cabin, a tiny beacon of warmth and promise in the growing twilight. They were home.